I'll bet you a kiss that you, Mr. Caveman, can't fix this thing in 3 days. With those words, a stuck-up heiress didn't just make a bet. She basically signed a surrender slip and had no clue. Who's never been underestimated? Challenged by someone who judged you by how you look, or because you were broke. This story is about that quiet power we all have when we turn other people's shade into our fuel. In this video, we're gonna find out how, without saying a single word, he used his brains and cunning to win over the most arrogant woman in the world. You don't have to be richer or better looking. As you'll see, forget the seduction games. This is the story of how a simple guy with work-dirty hands took apart the armor of a woman who lived for money and appearances. See how he saved her from herself. If you can, like the video and subscribe for more lessons like this one. Let's get started now. I'll bet you a kiss. The words left Isabella's lips sounding like shattered crystal in the thick, rustic air. That you, the caveman, can't fix that thing in 3 days. The Montana sun was a familiar weight on her shoulders, a heavy, expensive blanket of heat she had always known, but everything else here was an offense. The smell of dry grass and dust was a coarse irritant in the back of her throat, a world away from the curated gardens and city perfume she was used to. The laughter that followed her pronouncement was thin and brittle, the sound of her city friends, decorative and useless as she felt, delighting in the cheap theatre, her audience. Their amusement was a tonic, a temporary cure for the profound boredom that had been eating at her since she arrived. And the centerpiece of her stage was the irrigation system, a monument to expensive failure, its imported metal gleaming under the oppressive sun like a freshly polished casket. Engineers with clean hands and expensive degrees had poked at it for a week, their jargon filling the air like locusts, only to leave it just as silent, just as dead. Then, there was him, Liam Vance. He was a presence more than a person, a smudge of worn flannel and quiet competence that grated on her every nerve. He moved through this world of dirt and toil with a steadiness that felt like a judgment on her own restless discontent. His hands, calloused and stained with work, were an affront to her manicured world. He was the perfect target, a solid, unmoving object against which she could sharpen her wit. The contempt that rose in her chest felt good. It was a familiar flavor, a bitter warmth that made her feel powerful, alive. So she had spoken, launching her petty wager like a well-aimed stone, expecting to see a ripple of humiliation spread across his face. She wanted to see him flush with anger, to stammer, to refuse. She wanted a reaction that would feed the hungry emptiness inside her, something to entertain her friends, a story to tell later over cocktails, but the silence that followed her challenge was the wrong kind. It wasn't empty, it was heavy, weighted. The incessant buzz of insects in the tall grass seemed to fade away, the wind holding its breath. Liam straightened up from the fence post he was mending, and the slow, deliberate way he moved sent a tremor of unease through her. He turned to face her, and his eyes, when they met hers, were not what she expected. They held no shame, no anger, not even surprise. They were calm, the color of the sky before a storm, and they held a depth that seemed ancient. He didn't look at her like a groundskeeper being mocked by the owner's daughter. He looked at her like a mountain might observe a fleeting cloud. His gaze didn't deflect her words. It absorbed them, drew them in and rendered them meaningless, leaving them to dissolve in the vast, quiet space of his composure. For a terrifying second she felt like the fool. The air, thick with heat just a moment before, suddenly felt thin. A strange, almost cold shiver traced a path down her spine, a baffling contradiction to the sun beating down on her skin. The peace of the twilight was a comfortable silence, a shared space that no longer needed to be filled with nervous chatter. Liam came and stood beside her at the fence, the warmth of his presence a quiet anchor in the cool evening air. They looked out at the fields, at the visible proof of their shared victory. "I was thinking," he said, his voice low and thoughtful, fitting the gentle mood of the evening, "when things are more stable, we should start a foundation, an apprenticeship program, for kids who love the land, but don't have the means to get a formal education in it. Give them a place to learn, to work." The idea was so characteristic of him, so focused on building something new from the ground up, that Isabella felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the setting sun. It was the feeling of a future she desperately wanted to be a part of. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the crunch of gravel as a pickup truck pulled up. A young ranch hand hopped out, holding a small stack of mail. "Sorry, boss," he said, handing it to Liam. "This just came in with the late delivery." Liam thanked him and began to sift through the envelopes under the truck's fading headlights. Bills, a farming journal, a flyer for cattle feed, and then one that was different. It was made of a heavy, cream-colored paper that felt out of place among the rustic correspondence. In the top left corner was a corporate logo, a sharp, aggressive-looking emblem of interlocking geometric shapes that seemed alien and hostile in the soft light. Isabella saw the change in him before he had a chance to hide it. It was nothing overt, but his hands, which were always so steady and purposeful, went utterly still for a fraction of a second. His easy posture tightened, the muscles in his shoulders bunching almost imperceptibly. She watched his face, and for a terrifying moment, the quiet peace in his eyes was gone, replaced by a flicker of an old, hunted tension, a door opening for a split second onto a much darker room. He quickly shoved the letter into his back pocket, his expression smoothing back into a neutral mask. "What is it?" she asked, her voice soft. "Nothing," he said, a little too quickly. "Just junk mail." But the lie was a tangible thing between them in the cool night air. A sudden cold stone dropped into the warm, quiet pool of their newfound peace. The war for the farm was over, but it was suddenly, terrifyingly clear that a war for Liam himself had just begun. What did Isabella's journey teach you about the hidden potential in the people we are quickest to judge? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel to continue the journey. For what dark reason did a brilliant mind like Liam's go into hiding? And now that his old world has found him, will it come to reclaim its lost prodigy, or to bury him for good? The sun was beginning its slow descent, bleeding gold and rose across the vast Montana sky. Isabella walked along the edge of the north pasture, the very same field that had been the site of so much destruction and despair. Now the new shoots of alfalfa were a vibrant, almost electric green under the soft, forgiving light. She stopped and leaned against a sturdy wooden fence post, feeling the familiar warmth of sun-baked wood under her palms. For years, a tense, restless energy had been her constant companion, a frantic buzzing just beneath her skin that had made stillness impossible. It had been the engine of her boredom, the fuel for her casual cruelties, but now it was gone. In its place was a quiet she had never known. For the first time she could remember, she took a full, deep breath. She felt the air, cool and clean, travel all the way down, filling every corner of her lungs, a sensation so new and so profound it almost made her dizzy. With the slow exhale, a knot of tension she had been carrying for a decade in her jaw and shoulders finally, completely released its grip. It felt like laying down a heavy, invisible burden she hadn't even been fully aware she was carrying. That cold, tight coil of anxiety that had lived in her stomach for as long as she could remember, a feeling like a shard of ice lodged deep inside her, had simply melted. A gentle warmth spread through her, a quiet, cellular-level peace that felt more real and more valuable than any inheritance. She thought of the girl she had been just weeks ago, standing on the veranda, wielding her boredom like a weapon. She didn't feel shame or disgust for that person anymore, only a distant, gentle pity. That girl had been starving, not for attention or luxury, but for a sense of purpose so fundamental that she hadn't even known how to name the ache. She had been trying to feel powerful by making others feel small, never realizing that true power was the quiet, steady hum of a world put right. She had wanted to be the queen of a kingdom, but had mistaken the throne for the land itself. She ran her fingers over the rough grain of the fence post. This was real. The smell of the cooling earth, the sound of the crickets beginning their evening song, the immense peaceful weight of the sky above her. This was her kingdom. Not the grand house behind her or the name she carried, but this feeling, this stillness, this quiet, unshakable sense of being exactly where she was supposed to be. The sun finally slipped below the horizon, and in the gathering twilight, Isabella Thorne stood in the quiet heart of her new world, finally at peace. Weeks later, the dust of the confrontation had settled, and a new kind of quiet had taken its place. It wasn't the tense, brittle silence of impending doom that had preceded the bank's final visit. It was a deep, resonant peace, the sound of a body beginning to heal. Isabella stood on the veranda, the same veranda from which she had once watched Liam with such casual contempt, and she listened to the new music of the farm, Before, the prevailing sounds had been of struggle, the strained whine of old machinery, the tired, clipped voices of the ranch hands. Now the air was filled with a confident, rhythmic hum. It was the sound of the irrigation system, recalibrated and efficient, whispering life back into the soil. It was the sound of engines running smoothly, of collaborative shouts across the fields, of work being done not with desperation, but with a renewed and steady purpose. The very air felt different. The thick, oppressive atmosphere that had smelled of debt and decay had been washed away. Now the breeze that drifted up from the fields was clean and sharp, carrying the scent of freshly turned earth, chlorophyll, and the faint, promising tang of diesel. It was the smell of a future, a scent she had never realized she was missing. Her gaze fell upon two figures, standing by the hood of a dusty pickup truck near the main barn. Her father and Liam. They had blueprints spread across the hood, and her father was leaning in, his posture one of rapt attention, his face stripped of its harsh, prideful mask and replaced by an expression of genuine inquiry. He was listening. He was asking questions. Liam stood beside him, not as a subordinate but as a peer, tracing a line on the paper with a calloused finger, his voice too low for her to hear, but his calm, assured demeanor speaking volumes. The rigid, suffocating hierarchy of the Thorn Ranch had been dissolved and redrawn based not on bloodline, but on brilliance. The change had trickled down through every corner of the farm. The ranch hands, men who had spent their lives taking orders from her father, now approached Liam directly. They came to him not with the deference of a servant, but with the respect of a student approaching a master, asking his opinion on everything from a sick animal to a stubborn engine. They spoke of him in low, slightly awed tones when they thought no one was listening. This new world was quieter, more efficient, and infinitely more honest. The victory had not been a loud, explosive event, but a fundamental reordering of their reality, a shift toward truth. Isabella leaned against the veranda railing, the wood warm from the afternoon sun, and took a deep breath of the clean, new air. There was no sweet taste of personal triumph on her tongue, no surge of ego. There was only a profound and quiet sense of rightness, a feeling of having finally helped to put a dislocated world back into its proper place. The formal dining room had become a makeshift gallows. The long, polished mahogany table, usually set for celebratory dinners, was now strewn with documents that smelled of ink and finality. The air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of defeat and stale coffee. Isabella's father sat slumped in his chair, a king presiding over the dissolution of his own kingdom, his face a grey mask of resignation. Her brother Jason stood by his side, a perfect picture of feigned filial sorrow. At the head of the table sat Mr. Henderson, the man from the bank, his voice a low, sympathetic murmur that was somehow more brutal than a shout. The rustle of the foreclosure papers as he pushed them across the table was the only sound, a dry, whispering hiss like dead leaves skittering across a tombstone. He was just uncapping his pen, the final stroke that would sever the Thorn family from their legacy, when the dining room doors opened. Isabella didn't burst in. She entered with a calm that was more shocking than any outburst. All eyes turned to her. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a cold, steady fire. Her presence instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. The heavy blanket of despair suddenly charged with a new, sharp energy. "Stop," she said. Her voice wasn't the flighty, musical tone they knew. It was low, steady, and resonant, with an authority no one in that room had ever heard from her before. She walked to the table, and with deliberate, precise movements she laid out the contents of the wooden box. The first diploma landed on the polished wood with a soft, heavy slap. Then the second, then the rolled-up patents. The sound of the paper, heavy and official, hitting the wood was a series of pronouncements, each one a hammer blow against the lie that had brought them to this room. Her father stared, confused. The banker paused, his professional curiosity piqued. The blood began to drain from Jason's face, leaving a sickly, waxy sheen on his skin. As if on cue, the doors opened again. Liam stood there. He was clean, his hair damp, wearing a simple pressed shirt. He looked not at her father, but directly at the banker, his gaze level and unwavering. And then, at Isabella's nod, he spoke. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't plead or argue. He began to outline a plan. His words, calm and measured, cut through the room's despair like a surgeon's scalpel. He wasn't talking about begging for more time. He was laying out a detailed, multi-phase strategy for recovery and profitability. He spoke of soil regeneration, of water reclamation using his own patented drainage designs, of new crop rotations that would maximize yield while minimizing overhead. It wasn't a plea. It was a lecture, a masterclass in agricultural science and logistics. The banker, Henderson, slowly put down his pen. He leaned forward, his professional mask of polite sympathy melting away, replaced by an expression of sharp, undisguised fascination. A flicker of something, a stunned, dawning hope returned to her father's eyes. The only person who seemed to shrink was Jason, who stood frozen by the fireplace, the cold sweat now beading on his forehead, his entire foundation of deceit being dismantled, word by undeniable word. The power in the room had not just shifted. It had reversed its polarity completely. Night fell like a black velvet curtain, hiding the sins of the day. Isabella moved through the darkness, a ghost in her own home, her purpose a cold, hard stone in her gut. The journey to the small cabin at the edge of the property was a pilgrimage through enemy territory. Every rustle of leaves in the wind sounded like a footstep, every hoot of a distant owl like an alarm. But fear was a luxury she could no longer afford. When she reached the cabin, the door was locked with a simple padlock. The sound of the metal breaking under the force of a rock she found nearby was a gunshot in the immense quiet, and she froze, her heart leaping into her throat, listening. There was only the sound of the wind. She slipped inside, closing the door behind her, plunging the small space into an even deeper darkness. She didn't turn on a light. She used the thin beam from her phone, a sliver of white that cut through the black. The air inside was cool and still, and it smelled of him. That scent of wood smoke and soap was there, but it was woven with the faint aroma of old books and black coffee. It was the scent of a life lived with intention and without excess. The beam of light revealed a space that was Spartan, but not uncared for. A single bed made with military precision, a small clean table with one chair, a shelf with a dozen well-worn books. Her movements, once so languid and spoiled, were now sharp, precise, and economical. She was no longer a princess surveying her kingdom. She was a soldier on a mission, her grief and rage honed to a fine, sharp point. She started her search, her hands running over rough-hewn wooden shelves, her fingers probing the thin mattress. There was nothing, just the quiet testimony of a simple life. She pulled out the books, her light glancing over the titles. Advanced agricultural engineering texts sat beside works of classic philosophy. It was another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit the image of a simple handyman. Frustration began to prick at her, the fear that this desperate gamble would yield nothing. She knelt, running the light along the floorboards, and that's when she saw it. One plank, near the foot of the bed that was slightly scuffed, its edges not as tight as the others. Her heart hammered. Using her fingertips, she pried it up. It came away with a soft groan of old wood. Beneath it, nestled in the dark, cool earth, was a small, smooth wooden box. It felt heavy, significant. It was the only object in the entire cabin that felt hidden, the only thing that spoke of a past. She lifted it out and set it on the table. For a moment, she just looked at it, her breath held tight in her chest. This was it, the answer. With trembling fingers, she lifted the simple brass latch. The lid opened with a quiet sigh. The smell of dry, aging paper rose to meet her, the scent of a life carefully packed away. Inside there was no treasure, no money. There was something far more valuable. Sheets of crisp, important-looking paper. Her light fell upon the embossed seal of a prestigious university, her own father's alma mater, and a name, Liam Vance. Beneath it, another name, Master of Science in Civil Engineering. And another, Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Engineering. Underneath the diplomas were rolled up schematics, dense with technical drawings for advanced farm machinery, and the heavy official documents of patents filed in his name. She sank into the chair, the papers spread before her like a royal flush. The frantic, desperate energy of her search settled into a cold, heavy certainty. These weren't just papers. They were weapons. For hours, Isabella remained a prisoner in her own room. The grey afternoon light bled into a bruised twilight, and still she lay pinned to the bed by the crushing gravity of her failure. Despair was a physical state, a slow, cold flood rising inside her, silencing thought, numbing sensation. The world outside her window ceased to exist. There was only the oppressive silence of the house and the suffocating certainty that she had broken everything she had touched. It was during a moment of restless movement, a turn to escape the ghosts in her own mind, that her hand brushed against something coarse on the polished nightstand. One of the housekeepers, in a flurry of cleaning up the muddy chaos from the night before, must have left it there. It was a simple folded work shirt. Faded blue flannel. His. She sat up, the first real movement she'd made in what felt like a lifetime. She picked it up. The fabric was rough under her fingertips, worn soft at the collar and cuffs, a testament to long hours of labor. And then there was the smell. It wasn't the curated, expensive scent of her world. It was the scent of reality. It was wood smoke, the clean, sharp smell of cheap bar soap, and the faint, honest tang of sweat and sun-baked cotton. It was the smell of the man she had ridiculed, the man she had destroyed. The scent was a key. It unlocked a torrent of images in her mind, not as thoughts but as pure sensory data. The whisper scratch of his pen flying across a cheap napkin, the low, confident murmur of his voice as he made complex numbers sound simple, the solid, unmoving strength of him when she delivered her foolish payment, a strength that had nothing to do with muscle. And with that flood of sensory proof, a question ignited in the fog of her despair, a single sharp spark of light. Where did it come from? The brilliance, the knowledge, the effortless engineering. That kind of competence wasn't accidental. In her world, a man who worked with his hands was just that. But Liam was an architect, a mathematician, a strategist, all hiding in plain sight. The grief and guilt inside her didn't vanish, but something new and powerful began to burn alongside it. Rage. A furious, protective rage against the injustice of it all. The solution wasn't to cry or to confess. A confession would be her word against her brothers, a battle she would lose. The solution was truth. She needed proof, not of her brother's guilt, but of Liam's worth. She needed to answer the question that was now screaming in her mind. Who is Liam Vance? The answer, she knew with a sudden, startling clarity, was not here in this house of lies. It was in the one place that was entirely his cabin. A physical change moved through her. The crushing weight on her chest didn't disappear, but it shifted, transforming from a paralyzing burden into a source of compressed energy, a fuel for the fire. She stood up, and for the first time that day her spine was straight. The fog in her mind burned away, leaving behind a cold, crystalline purpose. She looked out her window, past the drowned fields, to a small dark shape nestled in a copse of trees at the edge of the property. His empty cabin. It was no longer a symbol of her failure. It was a lock she had to pick. The chaos of the flood eventually receded, leaving behind a thick, stunned silence that was far worse. Dawn broke not with a triumphant gold, but with a weak grey light that revealed the full scope of the devastation. Isabella found herself in her father's study, the room that had been the setting of her hopeful fantasies. Now it was a tomb. The air was cold, and the scent of damp earth and decay had seeped into the expensive leather and polished wood, a smell of ruin that would not be easily scrubbed away. Her father stood by the window, his back to the room, his shoulders slumped with a weight she had never seen him carry before. Her brother Jason stood near the fireplace, his face a carefully constructed mask of somber concern. No one spoke. The silence was a physical presence, thick and suffocating. When her father finally turned, his face was like granite. The fire of his usual anger was gone, replaced by something colder, heavier. His eyes, when they met hers, were empty. "It's a disaster," he said, his voice flat, the words dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well. "The bank was already breathing down our necks. This might be the end." He took a breath, a ragged, tired sound. "The foreman says the sluice gate was tampered with, deliberately." Jason made a small sound of shock, a perfect, calculated performance. But her father's gaze remained on Isabella. "It doesn't matter." All this trouble started when he showed up. The unspoken accusation hung in the air, directed at Liam but glancing off Isabella. "Tell him to be off the property by noon. I don't want to see his face again." Isabella's mouth opened, a protest forming, the words, "No, it was Jason, it was my fault," clawing their way up her throat. But no sound came out. The guilt was a physical hand clamped over her mouth, strangling the truth before it could be born. It was her fault. The logic was a cruel, perfect chain. Her petty bet had put a spotlight on Liam. His success under that light had bred her brother's jealousy. That jealousy had overflowed and drowned the north pasture. And now the consequence of it all was falling on the one innocent person in the entire equation. She had made him a target, and now she was watching the axe fall, frozen and mute. She numbly left the study and walked back to her room, each step an immense effort, as if her bones had been filled with lead. The luxurious trappings of her life, The silk of her dress, the soft carpet under her feet, felt obscene, a mockery of the ruin she had caused. She lay down on her bed, the daylight outside the window seeming harsh and intrusive. The silence of the house was no longer empty. It was filled with the sound of her own failure. It was the taste of ashes in her mouth, the feeling of a colossal weight settling onto her chest, pressing the air from her lungs, pinning her to the bed in the dark, silent ruin she had created. The sweet dream of hope was shattered by a sound. It began as a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the old house, a noise that felt fundamentally wrong in the deep silence of the Montana night. Isabella sat bolt upright in bed, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs. It wasn't thunder. It was too constant, too greedy. It was the sound of tearing, of something immense being ripped apart. It was joined by a roar, the sound of a hungry, angry river where no river should be. She was out of bed in a second, her bare feet cold against the floorboards as she ran to the window. What she saw was a nightmare painted in silver and black by the cold light of the moon. The north pasture, the very same field that had been the subject of Liam's napkin brilliance, was a churning black lake. The water was a moving, living thing, swallowing rows of prize crops, its surface littered with the dark shapes of debris. A scream caught in her throat. She ran. Down the stairs past the portraits of her ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to watch her in silent judgment. She burst out the front door into the damp, cold air, and the smell hit her like a physical blow. It was the smell of murder. The thick, rich scent of fertile earth was choked by the stench of mud and decay, the smell of a season's work and a fragile new hope being drowned in the dark. Other lights were flicking on. Shouts echoed in the distance. But for Isabella, the world had narrowed to this single horrifying tableau. Then a figure emerged from the shadows of the main barn. Her brother, Jason. He was already dressed, his boots muddy. "Bella, my God, what's happened?" His voice was a performance of shock, each word brittle and sharp. He ran to her, grabbing her arms, his face a perfect mask of horror. "The main sluice gate. It must have burst!" But as he spoke, Isabella wasn't listening to the words. She was watching his eyes. They were wide with feigned panic, but deep inside them, behind the frantic act, she saw it. The same cold, sharp glint of steel she had seen that afternoon. The connection was instant, a synaptic flash of lightning that illuminated the entire ugly truth in her mind. The look in his eyes, the convenient failure of the one piece of infrastructure Liam hadn't yet had time to reinforce. The timing, it all clicked into place with a sickening final sound. The floor of her world didn't just crack, it vanished. It was a plunge, a sudden, terrifying freefall into a silent, roaring darkness. The shouts of the ranch hands faded. The chill of the night air disappeared. All she could feel was the icy grip of her brother's hands on her arms, and all she could see was the truth. The flood wasn't an accident. It was an act of war, and the sweet taste of victory that had filled her mouth just hours before was now nothing but the bitter, gritty taste of mud. A new feeling began to dawn in Isabella, as subtle and persistent as the morning light. The collection of secret observations, the napkin schematic, the effortless mental calculus, the quiet way other workers now deferred to his judgment, began to coalesce in her mind, transforming from a confusing mystery into a breathtaking possibility. Liam Vance wasn't an anomaly to be solved. He was an asset to be deployed. He was a key. And for the first time, standing on the land that had for so long felt like a beautifully decorated prison, Isabella felt the tumblers of a lock begin to turn. The air itself seemed to change. The heavy, oppressive weight of the Montana heat lifted, and what was left felt light and effervescent in her lungs, like breathing champagne. The constant rhythmic sounds of the farm, which had always been a monotonous background drone, resolved into a symphony of purpose. Hope, when it finally arrived, was a dizzyingly sweet flavor on her tongue. It was a potent antidote to the slow-acting poison of her own uselessness. She found herself walking the grounds not with restless boredom, but with a new sharp focus, seeing everything not as it was, but as it could be. The struggling north pasture wasn't a problem for her father anymore. It was a project for Liam. The inefficient harvest routes weren't a source of loss. They were an equation for Liam to solve, and she was the one who had found him. The thought was intoxicating. She began to indulge in a fantasy, replaying it in her mind until it felt like a memory. She would walk into her father's study, the room that smelled of leather and quiet disappointment, and she wouldn't be the decorative daughter. She would be a strategist. She would lay it all out, the evidence of Liam's quiet, staggering genius, and watch as her father's expression shifted from paternal indulgence to genuine, stunned respect. In this daydream he would look at her, truly see her for the very first time. This imagined victory was a balm on a wound she hadn't realized was so deep. It even allowed her to reframe her own past cruelty as a stroke of brilliance. The humiliating bet hadn't been an act of a bored, petty girl. It had been an unconventional stress test, a crucible that had revealed the pure metal of his talent. Yes, that's what it was. She was the brilliant, discerning eye that had spotted the diamond in the rough. Buoyed by this new narrative, the tension in her shoulders, a companion she'd had for years, finally began to dissolve. One late afternoon, she stood looking over the fields that were now greener and more vibrant thanks to his work, feeling the sweet, warm breeze on her face. The world for a moment felt perfect, a kingdom she had helped save. Then a shadow fell over her. Her brother Jason had come up beside her, his presence instantly pulling the warmth from the air. He smiled at her, a wide, friendly expression that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "You look happy, Bella," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. And in his eyes, she saw a flicker of something cold and sharp, a glint of steel that made the sweet taste of victory in her mouth suddenly feel fragile and thin. The world she had known began to lose its flavor. The conversations with her friends, once the central currency of her existence, now felt like listening to a radio station playing the same 3 songs on a loop. Their talk of parties, of fashion, of who was seen with whom in the city, was a stream of meaningless noise that washed over her without leaving a mark. She would nod and smile, a ghost at her own table while her attention was elsewhere. She had become a watcher, a secret student of Liam Vance. From the shaded corner of a porch or the dusty window of an unused upstairs room, she observed him. It became a quiet, consuming obsession, a puzzle she was compelled to solve. She told herself it was intellectual curiosity, a need to understand the anomaly he represented. But deep down, she knew it was something more, a gravitational pull towards the quiet, solid center of his world. And the more she watched, the more the puzzle deepened. One afternoon, she saw him talking with the senior foreman at an outdoor table, the man's face a mask of frustration over a persistent drainage issue in the north pasture. Liam listened, his gaze fixed on some distant point. Then, with a casualness that stunned her, he grabbed a paper napkin from the dispenser, pulled a pen from his pocket, and began to draw. It wasn't a rough sketch. It was a dense, intricate web of lines, angles, and calculations, a complex system of subsurface drainage flowing from his pen onto the cheap, flimsy paper. It was a throwaway thought that could save 100 acres, a piece of casual brilliance that he folded and handed to the foreman, who looked at it as if it were scripture. Isabella felt a jolt, a sense of seeing something precious and hidden that was not meant for her eyes. Another time, she overheard him settling a dispute about the logistics of the harvest. 3 men were arguing over schedules, fuel allocation, and manpower, their voices rising in a cacophony of stress. Liam intervened, his voice calm and low. He didn't use a phone or a calculator. He just stood there, eyes half closed for a moment, and then began speaking, rattling off numbers and routes and schedules with a terrifying, fluid precision. The men fell silent, their expressions shifting from agitation to awe. He wasn't just managing. He was optimizing, seeing the entire operation as a single, complex equation that his mind solved effortlessly. Her brother Jason was the first to notice her new fixation. He approached her one evening as she was staring out at the fields, a silhouette against the deep orange sunset. "Be careful, Bella," he said, his voice a smooth, sweet syrup. He draped an arm over her shoulders, a gesture that was meant to feel protective but instead felt like a cage. "I see you watching the hired help. Don't get your head turned by a little bit of rough charm. Men like that, they have their place." His words were coated in concern, but they left a cold, oily film on her skin. It was the first time she realized that she was not the only one watching Liam, and for reasons she couldn't yet articulate, the feeling of her brother's gaze on the situation felt infinitely more dangerous than her own. The web was growing more complex, pulling tighter, and she was beginning to feel the vibration of a spider, somewhere nearby in the shadows. Each step she took across the damp field was a negotiation. Her pride, a fierce, wounded animal, clawed at her, screaming at her to turn back, to conjure a witty dismissal, and retreat to the safety of the veranda where her friends were now gathering like vultures, sensing a kill. They were watching, their faces a mixture of amusement and disbelief, waiting for the punchline of the joke she had started 3 days ago. But her body wouldn't obey. It was being pulled forward by the undeniable humming truth of the resurrected machine and the memory of his calm, steady gaze. The world seemed to shrink with every yard she crossed, the vast Montana sky collapsing, until all that existed was the man, the machine, and the charged space between them. The sound of her friend's expectant whispers faded into a low, irritating buzz, like flies trapped behind a window pane. He turned as she approached, his movements unhurried. He didn't smile. He didn't smirk. He simply watched her arrive, his face partially shaded by the brim of his worn hat, his expression unreadable. Up close, she was assaulted by a universe of sensations she had spent her life ignoring. The air around him smelled of the sun-baked earth, of clean sweat, and the faint sharp tang of grease and metal. It was the scent of actual work, honest and raw, and it was so foreign that it made her feel dizzy. She could see the fine lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the sun, the dark stubble on his jaw, the way the fabric of his flannel shirt was worn thin over his shoulders. She had to stand on her toes slightly to reach him, a small act of vulnerability that felt like leaping from a cliff. And then she fulfilled her promise. The contact was a detonation. It wasn't a kiss of victory or romance. It was a brand, a flash of heat and pressure that incinerated every carefully constructed lie she told herself about him, about herself. It was the rough texture of his shirt under her fingertips, the surprising softness of his lips, the solid, unmoving strength of him. For a single terrifying second, her entire universe, with its carefully policed borders and hierarchies, was wiped out by pure, unfiltered sensation. A bolt of lightning shot through her, burning away the boredom, the arrogance, the icy detachment, and leaving behind nothing, a clean slate, a ringing silence in her mind. It was over as quickly as it began. She pulled back, her breath caught in her chest, her lips tingling with a phantom heat. She braced herself for the aftermath, the triumphant laugh, the mocking comment, the satisfaction in his eyes. She was prepared to endure his victory, but it never came. Liam just looked at her for a second, his gaze clear and direct. A small muscle twitched in his jaw. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging a debt paid in full. Then he turned, picked up a wrench from the ground and walked back toward the humming pump, his attention already claimed by the next task. He just went back to work. Isabella was left standing alone in the middle of the field, the sound of her friend's distant, confused laughter finally reaching her. The air she drew into her lungs felt different, charged. The sun on her skin felt hotter. The ground beneath her feet no longer felt quite so solid. The game had ended, but the man she had been playing against hadn't even known it was happening. It was a sound that woke her on the third day, not the familiar gentle whisper of the wind through the cottonwood trees or the distant lowing of cattle. This was something new, a low resonant hum that vibrated up through the floorboards of the house, a sound of immense dormant power stirring to life. Isabella lay still in the luxurious prison of her silk sheets, her mind struggling to place it. Then it was joined by a second sound, a soft sweeping hiss like 1,000 sharp breaths taken in unison. It was the sound of water, but not the chaotic roar of a flood. This was controlled, rhythmic, and impossibly it was coming from the fields. She threw back the covers, the cool morning air a shock against her skin, and went to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain. The sight stole the air from her lungs. Below, in the golden light of the new sun, the dead machine was alive. It was a resurrection. Perfect shimmering arcs of water were being thrown across the thirsty earth, a silent, intricate ballet of engineering. The water caught the light, breaking it into a million tiny rainbows, each drop a testament to his victory and her spectacular misjudgment. He hadn't just fixed it. He had tamed it, transforming it from a broken heap of metal into something graceful, something alive. He was standing near the central pump, not admiring his work, but watching the distribution with a focused intensity, his head cocked as if listening to its heartbeat. For a long moment, Isabella just stared, the world of her own making, of mockery, of assumed superiority, dissolving in the face of this undeniable truth. The bet, the words she had thrown so casually, so cruelly, came back to her. They were no longer a joke. They had solidified in the morning air, becoming a physical weight, a binding contract she could feel settling onto her shoulders. A voice in her head, the familiar venomous whisper of her own arrogance, urged her to ignore it, To laugh it off, to pretend the wager was just a silly game. But the evidence before her was too powerful. The steady hum of the machine was a pulse she could feel in her own teeth. The sight of the life-giving water was a verdict that could not be appealed. Something that had been frozen and brittle deep inside her for years finally snapped. The decision to go down there, to walk across that field and face him, was not a conscious choice. It was an involuntary reflex, like pulling a hand back from a flame. Her feet were moving before her mind had consented, carrying her out of the room, past the sleeping wings of the house and out into the morning, towards the man who had just dismantled her entire world with a few worn tools and a quiet, unshakable competence. This unsettling feeling was not new. It was a familiar ghost that haunted the long, quiet hallways of the sprawling ranch house. Isabella left the cooling air of the veranda and stepped inside, the scent of lemon polish and old wood closing in around her. She found herself drifting towards her father's study, the heart of the Thorn Empire. The door was open. The air inside was thick with the smells she associated with a legacy she didn't know how to inherit. Aging leather, the ghost of expensive cigars, and the faint, sweet scent of bourbon. It was the smell of power, of decisions made, of a world in which she was a visitor, a pretty object placed carefully for effect. Here, surrounded by portraits of stern-faced ancestors and shelves of books that had never been opened by her, the feeling took on a definite shape. It was the suffocating weight of her own uselessness. She was a thorn. The name was supposed to be a key, but for her it had always felt like a cage. A beautiful gilded cage where she was fed, clothed, and admired, but never ever taken seriously. Her opinions on the farm's management were met with a patient, dismissive smile from her father. Her ideas for the future were treated like the charming notions of a child. She was a decoration, something to be shown off at parties and kept polished and placid. And this slow, quiet suffocation had bred a desperate, ugly thing inside her, a hunger to feel important, to have an impact, to make a mark on the world, even if that mark was a scar on someone else. Her cruelty wasn't a sport. It was a survival mechanism. It was a transfer of weight. She would take the crushing burden of her own inadequacy and try to force it onto someone else's shoulders. The ranch hands, the maids, her friends from the city, they were all just actors in the private dramas she staged to feel a flicker of control. And Liam Vance, with his silent competence and his refusal to be impressed by her name, had become the lead in her newest production. He was supposed to be the easiest of targets. His rustic simplicity should have made him buckle under the slightest pressure of her sophisticated disdain. She had wanted to see him crumble, to affirm her place at the top of the food chain. But he hadn't. That was the problem that was now lodged deep in her gut. He had stood there in the dirt and refused to play his part. He had looked at her not with fear or anger, but with a placid indifference that had rendered her entire performance hollow. He didn't just shrug off her insult. He had, in his quiet way, held up a mirror, and for the first time she was forced to see the desperate, ugly thing she was trying to hide. The war she was waging wasn't with a simple groundskeeper. It was with the suffocating silence of her own life. From the sweeping veranda that overlooked the fields, Isabella watched him. The wine in her glass was a deep, expensive red, the kind that usually coated her tongue with notes of dark cherry and quiet satisfaction. But now it tasted like metal, a sour, acidic tang that was the flavor of her own failed cruelty. She swirled the glass, watching the liquid cling to the crystal, and replayed the scene in her mind. His silence. That was the thing that had burrowed under her skin. It was a silence that hadn't been empty or submissive. It had been full, a quiet refusal to participate in her game, a denial of the power she thought she held so effortlessly. The humiliation she had so carefully crafted for him had ricocheted, and the impact had left a hollow ache in her own chest. She had intended to make him feel small, but instead she was the one who felt strangely diminished, exposed under the vast, indifferent sky. Her friends were inside, their chatter and laughter a meaningless echo that couldn't reach her here. Her world felt distant, flimsy. Her attention was captured by the lone figure walking with an unhurried, steady pace toward the dead machine. The sound of his boots on the dry gravel was rhythmic, a soft crunching that seemed to measure out the growing distance between her reality and his. He wasn't marching into a battle he expected to lose. He approached the complex tangle of pipes and wires with the quiet confidence of a man entering his own workshop. There was no hesitation in his posture, no hint of the brute force she had mockingly anticipated. He stopped before the irrigator, and simply looked, his head tilted in a kind of silent communion. She watched as he raised a hand, those hands she had dismissed as crude, and traced the line of a steel conduit. The gesture was shockingly gentle, almost intimate, as if he were assessing the grain of a piece of wood or the pulse of a living thing. Then he began to work. There were no grand movements, no grunts of effort. He produced a simple, worn tool from his pocket, and the sounds that drifted back to her on the cooling evening air were not of violence, but of inquiry, a series of soft, inquisitive taps. A low metallic hum as he turned something unseen. It was a conversation, in a language she didn't speak, a rhythmic and methodical dialogue with the machine. Each quiet click, each gentle scrape of metal on metal, chipped away at the caricature she had built of him in her mind. The caveman was a brute. This man was a diagnostician. The sun began to dip below the mountains, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and fiery orange, and the fading light seemed to be pulling her certainty away with it. That sound, the soft, persistent music of a man solving a problem, was the sound of the first crack appearing in the flawless, polished surface of her world.